Oh, I'm gonna sing some hands. Somebody line them all. Oh, line them all. Don't need a line them all. Oh, line them all. I have time, heart, and soul. I look like ashes and smells like smoke, and I turn away. My love and kind try to feed my body and my mind, but it's too much emotion.
Right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third History Behind, and it's episode 3. And thank you very much for all of you for tuning in. I'm hoping that over the course of the next hour or so, we have an opportunity to really invite as many of you to take part in our chat. We're very fortunate to have two highly respected guests who have kindly given of their time. We have Charrise and Stelley. Charisse, are you there?
I'm here.
Great. Well, you're more than welcome. And I hope that, let me give you a little bit of an introduction. Charisse is currently at a postdoc at the University of Chicago, and she's in Chicago as we speak. She's also an assistant professor and Melian Faculty Fellow of Africana Studies and Political Science, I hope I get this right, at Charlton College in Minnesota.
Yes, that's correct.
That's quite a title, but I'm very, very pleased that you've been able to join us today. And let me just talk to you a little bit, for those of you who haven't had a chance to see any of the previous History Behinds, to give you an idea of what we're hoping to achieve today. And it really is an opportunity to look beyond and behind some of the lesser known, but clearly very important sources. And our colleagues here today have chosen 5 particular sources that they feel are important to them and help and reveal much about the civil rights movement in America. As I said, thank you very much, Charisse, for joining us today. And I'd like to move straight on, if that's all right, with the first of the slides and images that you've chosen. And I think for the first one that really struck me was the actual date of this. It's Washington, D.C. in 1933. Can you just tell me why you chose this one in particular to start?
Yeah, so just before I launched into the Scottsboro, so this is an image of a sort of protest around the Scottsboro case, but I just want to preface all of the images by saying part of what I'm narrating is an understanding of civil rights that's at the intersection of sort of Blackness, but also radicalism. Because as I understand it, the history of the United States, rooted as it is in what I would call racial capitalism, is really a question of the struggle against both sort of anti-Blackness and anti-radicalism. And so these sort of images that I've chosen reflect struggles that bring these two together. So with that being said, I chose this particular image because even though this image is 1933, it's a protest in 1933, the Scottsboro case actually started in 1931. And the fact that 2 years later, and even up to 10 years later, people are still struggling against the indictment and conviction of these 9 young boys is telling about the very slow pace of justice for Black people in the context of the United States. And so this particular image is of Black women and men and even children marching in front of the White House, demanding that President Roosevelt free the Scottsboro boys, so the Scottsboro 9, who had been convicted of, had been condemned to death for ostensibly raping 2 young white women. So do you want me to continue to go on with the story, or do you have another question?
I think it's fast. So this actually began during Hoover's presidency, and nothing has actually moved on in those 2 years. So they're protesting openly in front of FDR's White House. So the case hasn't moved.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think.
And what else?
Sorry, carry on, please.
Please. Yeah, what's important about this case in general is the Great Depression. So this is happening. All of this, what stages this whole sort of encounter between the Scottsboro boys on the one hand and the two white women who they're accused of raping, Ruby Bates and Victoria Price, is that they're on a train looking for work. So there's these two white women who are formerly textile workers who've hopped on a train looking for work, and then there's these 9 boys who are sort of also looking for better opportunities. And so that Great Depression context is really important because it attests to the conjuncture of sort of economic and structural lack at this moment, as well as sort of entrenched and endemic Jim Crow. Mm.
And did you find the date surprising that you could date some of these protest movements this early? I didn't consider there being protest movements this early. It's something that I haven't.
No, when one looks at Black radical history, or when one moves sort of anti-capitalist history to the center, you see a very, very, very long arc of protest. So, for example, in the 1920s, there are the Harlem Tenements League, for example, is organizing tenants to mobilize rent strikes, which we're seeing today, right? We're seeing the uptick in mobilizing for tenants' rights today. But this is happening throughout the 1920s. Of course, as we also know, the Garvey movement starts in 1916, but then takes off in the 1920s, which is the largest mobilization in history. And so these sorts of mass-based protests are nothing new. And so what we see by 1954 with both the Brown decision, but also the Montgomery bus boycott, there had been a long, long history of this kind of broad-based mass movement.
So the origins are here in this photograph.
Yeah, so this is a continuation, but what's striking about this photograph in particular is, number one, it's both women and men and children, and it's a sort of direct action. So they're going directly to the source. That is to say, they've moved beyond the Alabama context because there can't be justice there. And so they're actually petitioning the federal government to intervene on behalf of these 9 Scottsboro boys.
That's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And can we, one of the things that I think from our audience, many of them are teachers who may well be teaching the civil rights movement, maybe at GCSE, maybe at A-level. So for 16-year-olds and 8 to 18-year-olds, I think some of the things I particularly in this source, this is a great starting point for teaching the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s.
Yes, and so the other thing that we need to, go ahead.
No, I just interrupt you. Where you think we should start looking at the civil rights movement in general?
Yeah, so I start with Scottsboro always because of the mass-based internationalist nature of the mobilization to free these boys. And so part of the other thing about when we center sort of Black radicalism, it also challenges commonly held epochs, eras, and periodizations. And so to me, starting with 1931 in the Scottsboro case is important because it also influences the mass-based movement in 1935 against the invasion of Ethiopia, broad-based protests in the 1940s for the desegregation of the military, and then what we ultimately see called the civil rights movement, which starts in the mid-1950s and goes through roughly the late 1960s. But often civil rights is narrated through a liberal historiography, where we start with Brown and we start with Montgomery bus boycott. But as we see with Scottsboro, there's a much longer history.
Much longer history. And just out of interest, the image itself, what was it taken? What was the purpose of the photograph? Was it taken for mass publication? Was it for newspaper?
Yeah, so this image and images like it are circulated throughout the Black press,
right.
Just to sort of, it's both the Black press and presses like the Daily Worker, to show that, to keep sort of the Scottsboro case fresh in people's minds.
It's just interesting to think whether or not this actually got a mass attention via the media, or it was very sort of localized protest.
Well, the protests were happening virtually every day, every month. There was always some sort of action. And so this protest is both ordinary and extraordinary, if that makes sense. It's more representative of the broader sort of long array of struggle on behalf of Scottsboro than being sort of significant in it or iconic in itself.
Great. Thank you very much, Charrise. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Can we go on to the second slide? And an appeal to the world. Yeah. And what's the story behind your choice for number 2?
So an appeal to the world is very important because, again, part of what I'm trying to narrate is the internationalist scope of American civil rights. An appeal to the world is very important because it is a petition that's filed before the United Nations in 1947. It is actually the second petition. There was one that was filed in 1946 by the National Negro Congress, but because Eleanor Roosevelt and other Americans petitioned for that sort of, they buried that petition. Du Bois got permission from the NAACP to edit this particular petition. And essentially what they're doing is internationalizing the struggle for Black rights, because the argument is that it's not only anti-Blackness in the US is not just a national issue, it's an international issue. And moreover, because the federal government abdicates its responsibility to Black citizens, they abdicate their responsibility to states' rights. The US needs to move, or Black people need to move beyond the confines of the United States and expand the cartography of struggle in order to get, to have any chance of sort of getting, basic civil rights. And so there's a long title to this, and I'm just going to read it. It's an appeal to the world, a statement on the denial of human rights to minorities in the case of citizens of Negro descent in the United States of America, and an appeal to the United Nations for redress. So that's sort of the general background to the petition.
That's quite exciting.
Yeah, it is.
And so it's looking for a more global audience.
Exactly.
And one of the things, sorry, there's a little bit of a delay. Please, Charrise, carry on.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about another petition and in a couple of slides, but this one is important because it's filed with the Commission on Human Rights, which is a subset of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, which is a different sort of forum that the later petition is filed with. But as you're saying, essentially what Du Bois is trying to do is lay out the situation, the Black situation in the United States, as something that is not only a denial of civil rights, but a denial of human rights. And that basically the denial of human rights in this small context will have broader consequences internationally because of the rise of the United States to global hegemony at this moment.
And how far an audience did it reach? Did the publication reach? Do you have any idea how far it went?
Yes, because what they did with these petitions is they not only tried to file it or try to get an audience with the General Assembly of the United Nations, but they also would print thousands of copies and circulate them nationally and internationally. So over 250,000 copies of this petition got into the hands of people both in the United States and abroad.
Wow. And at 50 cents per publication. I noticed that at the bottom.
Yep. Well, it depends. If you bought in bulk, you could get that rate.
Okay. That's good to know. I mean, the one thing that I found really interesting in this photograph is that you've chosen a particular source that has a very, very strong international, it's almost an international story behind it. And one of the things that we try to delve into, and it's been really successful, is, and you've done this here beautifully, is how the history of this one source has had an effect on a much, much wider audience. How, just from a point of view of a teacher, how do you think we could actually use this in our teaching, do you feel?
Yeah, okay. So I actually do teach this in my class, and we charge genocide, which is the next petition I'll talk about. But what I want to, based on what you said, what I do want to say is there's a Dalit activist whose last name is Ambedkar, who actually, there's correspondence between him and Du Bois. And he actually wanted to use an appeal to the world as a model to protest the caste system in India, and to bring that issue before the United Nations. And so so that shows the sort of international scope and the international resonance of the struggle for Black civil rights. In terms of how to teach this particular document, It's not very long. And so what you can do is split it up over weeks, and maybe there's 6 chapters, and you can teach 1 chapter per week, and focus on the sort of political implications, the economic implications, and the social implications of what's being discussed. And also you can teach it in terms of strategy, like what are the strategies and tactics that have been employed historically in order to hold the United States accountable for, to its own basic narration of itself as the arbiter of freedom and democracy. So I think that there's a close reading sort of practice that can be inculcated in students to really look at not only what's being said, but to what end. Okay,
thank you. And did you find your students really responding to that? I mean, if you're teaching this, how did they respond to looking at such a positive and appeal to the world, a positive message like this?
What's really eye-opening to them is that, first of all, I don't think that students know very much history. Oh. Like, they don't realize that things happened before and that nothing was really new. A saying that I actually learned from Dr. Whitaker that he would say all the time in our African-American history class is history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think that that's absolutely apt. And what I'm going to write that down. I'm going to write that down. I think it's attributed to Mark Twain, but I don't know. But my source of it is Dr. Whitaker. But what this appeal shows is that they bring up issues of housing and issues of so like redlining with housing, issues of unequal access, issues of unemployment, things that continue to resonate into the present. And so I think that the students get a sort of broad sense of the ubiquity and the endurance of these type of social and economic issues.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And this is a source that you could. I really feel that behind it there is quite a lot of there's a ended conversation. I can see a lot of discussion that could come from this one particular source in the classroom, and that's what I thought instantly when I saw it was, well, this is something you could definitely draw out and really wrestle with as a historical source.
Yeah, the other thing that I'll say in terms of teaching it is that what you can do is set your students up in 2 teams and have them debate, right? Mm. You can pick particular issues in the petition itself and even have them debate the tactics. Like, is it good to internationalize this issue? Is it not? Like, is it, bad to embarrass the United States on the world stage, or is that a good tactic? Or, so debate, like setting students up into groups and having them take the affirmative or the negative on the issue is something that I do employ. And I think that this is a good source to do something like that.
Okay, great. Carol, can I just cut in if there's any questions at all from the chat? Is there anything that you'd like to add?
Hi, Andy. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, speaking. Yeah.
Brilliant. It's me. There is one. It's over here. I'm going to read it out for you. It's actually going back to Charrise's first image, I think. It's from Sarupa, and it says, "Why do you call the Scottsboro protest radical? Why do you call it radical?" is the question.
Yes. So what's radical about it is, so there's a whole bunch of background information that I did not say, because, academics are notoriously long-winded. So there's a lot I could say, but what makes this radical is that one of the organizations that took up the defense is the International Labor Defense, and this is the wing of the Communist Party. So the NAACP is who we commonly know as the sort of organization that did all of this litigation. But the International Labor Defense is exceptionally important in this regard because there's 2 important aspects of case law that came out of the Scottsboro case. One is Powell v. Alabama, which actually established the right to counsel in 1932, and one is Norris v. Alabama, which was handed out in 1935, which it was part of the reason why one of the convictions was overturned was because African Americans have been notoriously excluded from the jury pool. So all of that to say is that what the International Labor Defense did was implement a 2-pronged approach. They did the legal approach, but then they also did the mass-based internationalist approach. So there are people from Cuba to Mexico, Africa, and the Caribbean who are protesting the Scottsboro decision. And so this mass-based protest is something that emanates from the left. it's been moved to the center because we associate it with the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. But the NAACP actually was very critical of this approach initially. They did not support this approach. Even when Martin Luther King and the SCLC were organizing mass-based direct action approaches, the NAACP was very hostile. And so it's a leftist tactic to this direct confrontation is a radical, it's a radical move. So that's part of the reason why I would call the Scottsboro case an event in Black radical history.
Thanks. And also, Andy, just so you know, I've unmuted Matthew's microphone now. So if you want to ask him,
excellent,
to kind of come in,
Matthew, very nice to have you join in. So please, if you want to cut in any time, Charisse, I hope we can have a good discussion between the three of us here. We'll move on to your third choice of image. I'm conscious of the times that we have, and there is, what's the story? I guess the most obvious question is, what's the story behind your third choice?
So this image is of a woman named Rosalie Ingram, and these are her two sons. And thinking with the Scottsboro case, the Rosalie Ingram case was another case in which mass broad-based movement and organization was employed to free Rosalie Ingram and her two sons. So quickly, on January 26, 1948, in Schley County, Georgia, Rosalie Ingram, who was a sharecropper and a widowed mother of 11, and two of her sons were convicted of murder and sentenced to death. And so the victim, who was also the instigator, was a white man named John Stratford, who was their neighbor. And essentially what happened was he had assaulted Rosalie Ingram on November 4th, 1947, and was beating her in the head with a shotgun and just brutalizing her for many minutes. And so ultimately her 16-year-old son came and grabbed the gun away from him, struck him on the head, and he died. Rosalie Ingram immediately reported what happened, and her two eldest sons were thrown in jail. And what happened as a consequence of them being thrown in jail was that the landlord, where Rosalie Ingram, who owned the farm that Rosalie Ingram was sharecropping on, he expropriated her. So he stole all of her tools, all of her livestock, and all of her crops. And so this was a case that garnered sort of national and then international attention because it was yet another sort of representation of the legal lynchings of Black people. But it sort of turned that on its head because whereas often these legal lynchings were of Black men who were accused of raping white women, this was a Black woman who was accused of murdering a white man. So it really brought the gender question alongside the economic question into the fore. So that's the background.
That's quite a background. And the boys look a little older than 16. So this must have been taken quite a while later.
Yeah, so they did not end up getting paroled until 1959.
Right.
So it was so much like the Scottsboro case, this was a very long and protracted struggle for justice. So their case got commuted to life in 1948, but they were not ultimately released until 1959. But again, this broad-based protest, this time with Black women at the center, carried on this whole time. And indeed, and in fact, the boys filed a petition with this same Commission on Human Rights on behalf of Rosalie Ingram in 1949. So with this case also conveys how Black folks were using the United Nations as a forum to advocate for civil rights. And as we know, Malcolm X later on, shortly before his assassination, was planning to file another petition with the United Nations. So this becomes a strategy in Black history more broadly.
And did this case garner a lot of attention across America or just within the Black community?
It garnered a lot of attention across the United States, but also internationally. Of course, it was the Black press, and specifically the Black radical press, that took on this case, but it was in the consciousness of the nation as a whole, I would say.
Matthew, do you have any thoughts about the image itself?
I have all sorts of thoughts, but I will be brief and preface my remarks by saying that it's just a tremendous honor to be on a panel with Dr. Burton Stelley, who was a former student of mine. So I'm sitting here in awe, listening to her. She's certainly smarter than I am. but I am not at all surprised that she's doing as well as she's doing. But actually, quite frankly, my notes indicate here with the few pictures that we've gone through already remind me of a quote from John Henrik Clarke. I love quotes. Charisse knows I love quotes. In one of his most famous quotes, he was one of the most prominent Africanists in history. I mean, he said that all history is a current event. And I think the one thing that I hope that we leave this conversation with is understanding, as Charisse alluded to in just a second, that there's some sort of a gap in history. And one of the first things that I learned from my advisor, Darlene Clark Hine, who is primarily a historian of Black women's history, that whether it happened 5,000 years ago, 5 years ago, 5 minutes ago, all history is a current event. Because the legacies of everything that preceded us affect what's happening right now. And in fact, what we're doing right now will affect what's happening in the next 30 years or so. Unfortunately, for people of African descent, what that means is, at least for the last roughly 500 years, there has been no abatement. There has been no pause. There has been no respite or timeout from white supremacy and the tentacles and effect of cutthroat capitalism in the Western world. And so that's what keeps jumping out at me. And also the fact that this affected Black men, women, and children. You know, for so long in Black history, African American history, we knew only what happened to the boys and the men. This particular picture emphasizes the fact that no one was left unfettered within the Black community. And certainly the story and this is what I will finish with, certainly the story of the Scottsboro Boys reminds us of how long it takes to get justice, if you get justice at all, right? And Charisse, you can comment on this, but from the time the case happened to, I think, the death of the last living Scottsboro boy, who was then a man at that particular point, you're talking about a large swath of our history that this is happening. So these are the things that are primarily coming out in my mind. It's this continuity and change over time that historians are obsessed with. And unfortunately for Black people, the continuity has been oppressions at the hands of violent white extremism, cutthroat capitalism, and the Western world's denial of just how heinous enslavement, colonization, and Jim Crow were. And the change, oftentimes the changes come at a mortal cost for us. And those changes are always subject to rescission. And that's a lot of what we're seeing, particularly in America right now.
Charisse, do you feel is there a theme when you chose your 5 images? I know it's very difficult to find 5 sources. You probably could have had a lot more than 5, but did you find when you're choosing your 5, were you looking at one particular aspect? Were you studying something at the time that influenced your choice?
Well, basically the two things, it was sort of Black radicalism and Black internationalism, which is kind of both my training and my area of specialization, but some sort of through line of all of these cases is W.E.B. Du Bois. I co-wrote a book with the amazing historian Gerald Horne on W.B. Du Bois called W.B. Du Bois: Life in American History. And so not only is Du Bois always sort of top of mind for me in a specific era of Du Bois, which is the post-1935 Du Bois, but he's really an embodiment of Black history in a fundamental way from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century. He's involved in every major debate, issue, struggle, institution. Du Bois is there, but not as a singular figure, as a member of a collective or organization or cohort of scholar activists who are trying to figure out how to get free. And so there is sort of resonances of Du Bois in each of these cases that I've chosen, but I've also tried to choose things that you've probably never heard of, right? So if you've heard of Scottsboro, you know about the role of the NAACP, but almost certainly you don't know about William Patterson, who's the lead litigator or about the international labor defense. And so all of these cases, I'm trying to challenge what I call intellectual McCarthyism, which is the erasure or the sort of sanitizing of Black radicals, especially those who are communists and socialists, in order to tell a particular narration of American history.
Thank you, Charisse. That's great. I'm just gonna now move on to your next choice, Charisse. I think one of the most recognizable figures, Paul Robeson. There. I just wondered. I know a little bit about him, but for our audience, if possible, could you just explain a little bit of background about Paul and why you chose him?
Yeah, so Paul Robeson is probably the closest thing this nation has had to like a superhero. So he like is a living, well, he's deceased now, but at the moment in which he was alive, he was a stellar athlete, an actor, a wonderful singer, an artist, but also was fundamentally committed to Black liberation, workers' rights, anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and he paid dearly for it. And so part of how I narrate American history is this dialectic between like radicalism and repression. And so, and the repression of Paul Robeson is real. So once he started to speak vehemently against war and militarism and capitalism and anti-Blackness. So for example, in the span of 1 year, his income went from $20,000 to $2,000, right? And part of this has to do with the rescinding his passport, which I'll talk about next with my next thing or whatever. But like, so Robeson was he was really the first kind of superstar when that wasn't common in that era. He was internationally known.
And as a result, he gave a profile and gave light to a lot of the background that was happening in America for the Black community at the time.
Yes, absolutely. And, so many of the organizations that he was involved in and many of the sort of institutions that he built featured Black radicals who would go on to do amazing things. So one is Lorraine Hansberry. So Paul Robeson started a newspaper called Freedom Newspaper in 1951. And Lorraine Hansberry was one of its primary editors and writers. And so in fact, when Paul Robeson's passport had gotten revoked, she actually went to a peace conference on his behalf. And so there was a lot of young radicals who both Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois mentored, that and everybody will talk about this. Everybody talks about how large a figure Paul Robeson was in their own sort of political development. And so he's very, just like Du Bois, he's very important to sort of Black history and especially Black left history.
And he knew everyone. He was very well networked.
He was very well networked. The problem is that a lot of those, what we would call bourgeois Negroes, turned their back on him. Once he began to be disciplined by the Cold War state, a lot of people turned their back on him, one of which is Jackie Robinson. And so, people are like, Jackie Robinson. And I'm always like, forget Jackie Robinson. I hate Jackie Robinson, right? Because he went before the House Committee on Un-American Activities and basically condemned Paul Robeson. Mind you, Paul Robeson, William Patterson, and the ILD were instrumental in the desegregation of baseball. So without Paul Robeson, the work that Paul Robeson and his comrades did for the desegregation of baseball, Jackie Robinson wouldn't have been who he was. So that slap in the face, it's unforgivable to me. I'll never forgive him. But anyway, so yes.
Thank you, Charisse. I think, just knowing that he had a baseball background and he worked out, he became bigger than his sport, then he became bigger, and everywhere, throughout his life, he was a real pioneer, I guess. I think that's certainly from the work I've studied. An absolutely fascinating man. And in this scene, he is being presented in New York by the UN Secretariat.
Well, so he is presenting. So this picture is actually about We Charge Genocide, which is the second petition that I'm talking about. And so here he is presenting the U.S. Secretariat in New York with the petition, We Charge Genocide. So the full name is We Charge Genocide, the historic petition to the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States government against the Negro people. Another long title. Now, this picture is significant for a couple of reasons. Number one is because he was supposed to go and present that petition in Paris before the United Nations, except for his passport was revoked. And so William Patterson ended up going and presenting the petition. And unsurprisingly, once he did so, his passport was revoked. William Patterson, who was a member of the Communist Party. But so Paul Robeson submitted the petition to the Secretariat in New York, and then William Patterson went abroad and presented it. Right, We Charge Genocide is distinct from an appeal to the world because this was submitted to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, a convention that had been ratified just a few months before they filed this petition. And so essentially, whereas the earlier petitions were arguing about sort of discrimination, this was a charge against the United States government for intentional genocide against Negro people, right? Which is not extermination, but rather the ways in which the structural, the political, social, and economic fabric of the United States was predicated on the genocide of Black people. And so the point of the petition was not only to indict the United States on the world stage, but also to, again, galvanize a mass movement, not only on behalf of African Americans, but also on behalf of the other racialized people of the world who would be affected by the racism and warmongering and oppression of the United States, again, as it ascended to its sort of pinnacle of capitalist international leadership.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that we want to do as part of the history behind is to let our viewers have a chance to ask a few questions. Tom, are you there? Is there anything that you'd like? It's going well at that end.
Can you hear me okay? Still?
Yes, I can.
Brilliant. So we've got a question, actually, again, Charisse, going back a little bit, but Lauren is asking, how was the second son involved? I think it was this. I'll go back to the image, actually, just briefly. This one. How was the second son involved? Or was it simply by association that he was arrested with his mother and brother? So that's the question, first off.
Simply by association. He accompanied them to report the crime, and because he was there and because he's Black, he went to jail too.
Yeah. The other thing is I just want to tell you, there's so many amazing comments about your presentation. I'll read one of them to you so you can hear it. Lucy says, I love this. Our students' key question is, how far do you agree that the establishment of the civil rights movement was a product of the Roosevelt era, 1933 to 1945? So we study Scottsboro, and I really enjoyed hearing the explanation of the context in the first image. Thank you so much. That's a comment from Lucy.
Oh, thank you. Wait, was there a question about the...
No, I mean, that was the question she's using with her class. So I don't know whether you or Matthew have a comment on that, but the question is, how far do you agree that the establishment of the civil rights movement was a product of the Roosevelt era, 1933 to 1945?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you, Lucy. I appreciate your kind words.
Okay. Right. I think, well, if we can, I'm conscious of the time. And Matthew, I want to also have a chance for you to give your 5 sources as well. And Charisse, if you're happy to contribute like we have done here, I really like the idea of having a discussion. And it neatly moves us on to cancelled, which I guess is the other part of the story.
Yes. And so, we talk about cancel culture in the US. This is the big topic right now, cancel culture, which is actually just like, the bourgeoisie being sad about being admonished for not being able to be racist. But this is real cancel culture. OK, so I put 2 pictures of Du Bois's cancel passport and Paul Robeson's cancel passport. Robeson's was canceled in 1950. Du Bois's was canceled in 1952, which means that they could not travel internationally. And basically, their travel was deemed that it was not in the best interest of the United States. And so later on, they retroactively argued that the reason that these people couldn't travel was because they wouldn't sign an affidavit saying that they weren't members of the Communist Party. Now, when Du Bois is sort of challenging this decision, he says that when he tried to get his passport back in 1952 and 1954, there was no such stipulation. So indeed, and in fact, they were being disciplined because they were challenging imperialism, colonialism, racism, war, and all of these sort of maladies that really contravene the United States position that it's the leader of freedom and democracy. So the moral of, I won't be long-winded, but the moral of this story, or what these pictures are representative of, is the actual thing I want to discuss, which is Kent v. Dulles. And so Kent v. Dulles was handed down on June 16th, 1958, which actually overturned the right of the U.S. government to be able to suspend people's passports simply because they were members of the Communist Party, or simply because they had particular types of political beliefs. And what the Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas asserted was that the right to travel was a part of the liberty and freedom which citizens of the United States enjoyed, and that this could not be deprived without due process of law under the Fifth Amendment. And that this case actually tied travel to the basic democratic values and the freedom of movement that is foundational to this idea of citizenship and this idea of liberty. And so it's an important civil rights case, again, that we don't talk about very much, because it challenges the idea that you can be persecuted and you can basically, be condemned to carcerality because of your political beliefs. And I think that that's very important, right? Not least because a lot of the anti-communism and red baiting that's happening at the time is geared towards Black people. And they're red baiting civil rights. Even Martin Luther King was red baited, right? So communism was used to denigrate or undermine struggles for civil rights. And so this idea that, so it's important. So this idea that you cannot be your travel can't be undermined simply because you're a member of the Communist Party. It's important not just for communists, but for Black people and for Americans writ large.
And neither of them were allowed to leave the country at all in that period?
No, so they were not. And this is the era in which Robeson's income went from $20,000 to $2,000 because he could not travel internationally. He's an entertainer, right? He gets his money from singing and traveling. And so it's also implicit as a form of financial terrorism, right? It's like they were really starving him out. He couldn't make a living because he could not travel.
So how, just out of interest, how did he make a living if his options and his career was narrowed in that way?
So very quickly, there's something I call mutual comradeship that's endemic in Black radical organizing, where essentially they take care of each other. And so there are like sort of Black left organizations where he would be able to work as like an executive secretary. And then organizations who weren't too scared of the Cold War state would pay him to do speaking and et cetera. But it was a lot of collective, collaborative, community-oriented care. That was a lot of alliteration. That sustained Paul Robeson and people like Du Bois and people like Eslanda Robeson and Shirley Graham Du Bois and Marvell Cook and a lot of these Black radicals who could not get jobs because they were red baited, because they were blacklisted. So it really was a sort of community and collective effort to help Paul Robeson sustain himself.
Thank you, Charisse. I'm conscious of the time. Tom, is there any other questions that have been
There are. I've just run
posted that you give to Matthew?
Yeah, I've just run another poll there, Charisse, just because I find it interesting to know how many of the teachers present have actually seen these images before, because for me, it's not many. And in fact, the poll now that I don't know if you can see it on the polls, but it doesn't matter if you can't. Basically, the 83%, actually more now, there's more votes coming in, but around 80% of teachers haven't seen or used any of these images before in their teaching, mainly obviously in the UK. We do have a few international teachers joining us, but mainly UK audience teachers. So that just shows you how valuable this information is. And it also shows you, I think I mentioned this before the webinar, is when I was in school, you know, I didn't really get that much of a diet of really kind of diverse history, I guess. So and this is why it's really, really useful to see this.
Thank you, Tom.
Tom, can I jump in there?
Oh yeah, go on.
And we have got another question that goes back to the previous picture that we looked at from Scott.
Yeah.
And he was asking whether the previous image was an official photographer photograph.
I Googled it, so I don't know. It's just available on Google. It's from an archive.
Very good
I think
answer.
it's from the Schomburg, or from one of the. It's on a website for one of the archives. I think it's the Schomburg.
Okay. That's great. That's
Fab,
great.
thanks.
Charisse, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you going in, and hopefully you can continue as we continue the conversation. I'd like to formally introduce Dr. Matthew Whitaker, the founder and CEO of Diamond Strategies, a leading organizations and communities, and his work has been very well documented. Matthew, thank you for joining us today, and I feel that we've got so little time to spend with you both tonight, but in the 5, and I'm sure it was difficult, the 5 images that you've actually chosen tonight, this one struck me straight away, and I just wanted to know the story behind it straight away. So please, over to you. This first image.
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to join with you. Thank you for having me again. This image was a pretty common image, or rather a pretty common sign that was hung in restaurants and places of public accommodation west of the Mississippi River, or roughly the 98th meridian, as people of African descent began to migrate in large numbers from the rural South to the urban South, and from the rural and urban South to the North and West. And it's a part of American history. It's a part of Black history and civil and human rights history that many people don't know of, that migration of people of African descent out of the South to where I am, essentially in Arizona, the Southwest United States. And by this particular time, you had white vessels grappling with, white supremacist vessels grappling with the number of people of Mexican descent in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Many people forget that all of those areas were a part of Mexico until the United States essentially seized it from them through armed military conflict. And so as whites moved to this region of the country in larger numbers, they brought with them the racial etiquette that they had enjoyed and built in the South. And it was extended not simply to people of African descent, but to Mexicans. And Mexicans were defined, and I quote, by people with perceptible Mexican blood, which of course meant folks that were brown and clearly of indigenous descent through a process of mestizaje, the creation of a mestizo people, which of course the majority of Mexicans and Mexican Americans are. That was most of them. So if they were could be identified, right, as Mexican, they would be thrown out. These were signs to remind people of where their places were, and where they stood in terms of their value and their humanity. So I don't think it's an accident that it began with no dogs, Negro Mexicans.
And originally, I can see in the provenance of the source, it's Dallas, Texas, the restaurant chain.
Right. And I actually have one from Arizona, but it's buried in my garage someplace. So they were all over the place. And this was not unusual, because if you went to the Eastern Seaboard, you'd see signs that would say no dogs, no Negroes, no Irish, right? In certain parts of the Northeast, no dogs, no Negroes, no Italian Americans. So what this communicates us is this continuity over time in terms of where Black people stand. Always on the list, always at the bottom. But it also tells you about how whiteness is constructed, because in the beginning, these signs included the Irish, Slavs, Italians, But certainly by the time you get to World War I and certainly World War II, whiteness transcends European ethnicity. But blacks and Mexicans stay on the list, right? Mm-hmm. So I think this communicates that. It also communicates something indirectly, that which is what is not on the sign, right? What is it not communicating? What do you not see that can separate, right? So this is overt and explicit, but there are all sorts of things that folks did and continue to do in places of public accommodation that do not make them inviting for people of color, which make it impossible for them to patronize them.
And go for a meal in a restaurant.
Right. First and foremost, how much the food costs. Okay. Where it's located, how far it is to get there, the music being played, right? Folks are very deliberate about what the music is being played and why. I gave an example once to a D&I training group that I was involved in, some inclusion training. And I said, I worked with a guy at a company. He was the only African-American. He worked on third shift, meaning 1 a.m. to about 9 a.m. in the morning. He was by himself. He felt very isolated. As a consequence, became pretty depressed, didn't perform too well. Surprise, surprise. It was on the verge of being terminated. And I interviewed and asked him, so tell me about your experience in the job. And he told me when he worked, how isolated he was, how he didn't know anybody. His supervisors barely knew his name. But more importantly, when the supervisor said, well, you need to get to know some people, why don't you go to this brown bag lunch, right? That happens, I don't know, 4 a.m. or something like that with your peers. And he said, I thought I'd give it a try. And as I was walking down the hall, he said, I heard this really twangy, old fashioned country music. And he said, so, a lot of brothers don't really listen to country music. So he said, I thought about stopping and going back, but I kept going. Then I walked in, all white men in the room. I thought about leaving, but I decided I'd stay. Then they started eating, he pulled out his lunch and they were pulling out parsnips and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or whatever it is they were eating. His food was quite a bit different. And so I said, oh, you hit the tripwire then. And he said, what do you mean, Doc? And I said, on farms, they'll have this heated wire, this electrified wire to keep the livestock in so they won't wander away. And they bump it, they're buzzed, right? And they go back to where they're supposed to belong. They don't try to enter that other area. Signs like this are one strategy, but there are also social strategies like food, music, who's at the table that buzz you like an electric wire and let you know that you are not accepted. And so what we're dealing with now in society is people saying, I don't see any of these signs anymore. What's the problem?
Thank you.
But there's no problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, is there any initial questions that have come through the chat?
Let's have a look. There's certainly some comments. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, crystal clear.
Yeah, a few comments here. I've taught it a lot and not seen these images. I used this image with my year 10 and year 11 last week. They were shocked to see that this was a common sign in the south of the US. Somebody else uses the one with no Irish on the end. I think you mentioned it, Matthew. And that's it really on the comments on that one so far. Lots of tweets coming in about it. Let's have a look what people have said. Yeah, that's it really for now. But there's a lot of commentary anyway going on about it.
Thank you, Tom. We don't get a chance to see quite as much of that, but what we do have is a second image. And Matthew, I know this one that you've chosen. Can you tell me your thinking behind it, why you selected it over? I'm sure there were many, many more.
Yeah, again, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes continuity, right? As America finds itself the unfortunate host of riots and rebellions in our streets seemingly every day against structural racism and responses to it, including the governor of Florida's response yesterday by introducing new hyper stringent laws that would in fact criminalize nonviolent protests. It lumps those that are there to protest in with those who may be causing trouble. It's one of the most strident in the nation. This comes on the heels of President Trump signing an executive order banning diversity, equity, and inclusion training in all federal agencies, and banning funding to any entity receiving funding from the federal government that's involved in this work. However, when white people have protested from before the Republic existed to 1787, when our Constitution was signed, up until now, when they have protested, it has been viewed primarily as an act of patriotism. However, when people of African descent have taken to the streets, and whatever the protest looks like, it has been deemed unpatriotic, and you see laws immediately introduced into state legislators to suppress it, using the same old tired language, right? See this, one of the images in the back says, race mixing is communist. Folks over here like to blame on everything.
This is dating what sort of time period are we talking about?
Oh, this picture here is Little Rock. This is 1959.
Yeah.
And it's a rally right outside of the state capitol, hoping to bar Black kids from going to school with white kids.
And one of the things that struck me straight away, Charisse, are you still there? Charisse? We're having a few different. I'm sure she'll come back in a short while.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. It's the juxtaposition of the two men holding the flags. One is a young man. One is very much a businessman. They're standing side by side, both very stiff, very sort of kind of aware, perhaps, that they're being photographed. And I just thought that spoke volumes.
The contrast between the businessman and the other man?
Yes.
Yeah. So what's striking to me is the race mixing is communism sign.
Right.
Because part of what we need to understand about anti-communism is that it's really communism becomes a synecdoche for policing many things like internationalism, like anti-communism or anti-colonialism, like interracialism. And part of the linkage between interracialism and communism is that at least in theory, the Communist Party was the only organization to promote racial equality outright. And so communism was a way to police interracialism and the racial order as much as it was to protect the capitalist order and the economic system. And so I think that that's very striking, and this is a wonderful image to show that conjuncture.
Yeah. And was this particularly Little Rock? Was there a lot of obviously the obvious with Little Rock and the schools issue? Was there a lot of protests around Little Rock at the time?
Oh, yeah, there were protests all over the place. And many of them, in fact, most of them, involved families, women and children coming out of their homes after eating breakfast and spitting and throwing rocks on people of African descent, kids, trying to go to school. And another thing that strikes me about your observation about the guy in the suit and the guy who's dressed far more informally is that when I see those two, there's no differentiation. But what we know through surveys and studies and research is that the movement would not have been able to function without people in suits, city officials, business leaders, governors, presidents of the United States, enabling their movement. So history likes to portray white supremacists in the South, particularly during this time, as informal, uneducated, mullet wearing, white beater T-shirt wearing poor folks. And the reality is the entire movement to suppress freedom and equity for people that have African descent could not have functioned just with poor, illiterate white people. It needed people in every stage of society to be able to exact this.
And that's evident in the picture in front. You can see a cross section of society, a very varied cross section, and then the prominence of the building behind. And this would have been recognizable to the audience who would have seen this photograph. It looks more like it could be in a newspaper or even a national publication, but people would recognize, would they instantly recognize where these places are?
Oh yeah. This is not an uncommon picture, although most pictures of Little Rock are taken right outside of the school. And so you got to dig a little bit deeper for this one. One of the things that finally I would note too is the constant brandishing of the American flag during protests like this, with this sort of subliminal, not subliminal effort to normalize linking freedom and equality, patriotism and Americanness to whiteness, and implicitly making blackness, people of color, un-American, unpatriotic, right? Unequal. The iconography is important.
Thank you, Matthew. If we go on to our third image.
Sure.
This particular next source of the two girls. This speaks. There's so much here. I just wondered, first of all, how did you find it? How did you find a source like this?
I've done a lot of research and inquiry into restrictive covenants and the development of all white suburbs in America. The development of those suburbs are inextricably linked to the stagnation or inability to achieve transgenerational wealth, let alone equality before the law for Black folks, because most Americans' wealth is in their homes. White people own their homes at 3 to 4 times the rate of Black folks do. And that can be traced directly back to this golden era that many people perceive of in the United States immediately after World War II, when housing was being subsidized via the GI Bill for former soldiers. What they don't know is that aid was distributed in a discriminatory sort of way. So Black folks did not benefit from it as much as white folks did. And even if they did get the resources, these communities, Levittown in New Jersey, this town in New York, were barred people of African descent outright through restrictive covenants. And so they couldn't move into the neighborhoods. They couldn't purchase the homes with little interest. They couldn't then own those homes when they were older, where they could leverage those homes to help send their kids to college, buy them a car, help them with transportation, buy investment properties. We were left out of that. That was only 50 or 60 years ago. And as a consequence, it is directly fed into the imbalance of wealth within Black communities. If equity ran the gamut in our society in the morning, if all obstacles were removed and we all woke up tomorrow morning and there were no barriers, it would still take Black folks about 142 years to close the wealth gap between us and white Americans. And this is one of the reasons why.
So the origins date back even, just post the Second World War.
Right. And that's looked upon as being one of the most progressive times.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Right. And a lot of white people aren't even aware of what was happening, right, when they were doing this. They took advantage of the GI Bill. They bought themselves a home, creature comforts. They didn't realize that then highways were built from the urban areas to those suburbs so that they could go to work if they still had to go to work downtown at all. Most of the new jobs were out in the suburbs, but they never would have to pass communities of color and poor communities. And they didn't have to leave their dollars there, which siphoned off capital from communities. And as a consequence, services depleted, corruption ensued, underworld economies took off. This was all by design. But if you're just a regular white family, the woman was in an auxiliary during the war, the husband fought in the war, and now they're taking advantage of the GI Bill. Well, I didn't do anything to Black people. We just bought a home. Well, your white privilege, at this particular point, gave you an entree into financial and superiority and wealth creation that an entire generation of Black people did not get, coming on the heels of the Jim Crow era.
Charisse, are you there at all?
Yep, I'm here.
I just wondered how you would teach this to your students if you saw an image like this in class.
Well, so one of the things, so I would probably teach this image alongside Keonga Taylor's new book, Race for Profit. But I also would teach this alongside both An Appeal to the World and We Charge Genocide, because both of these petitions have extensive discussions of housing. Because alongside what Dr. Whitaker just mentioned, the redlining also was a means of expropriating wealth from Black folks. And so, as we know, like from insurance companies to realtors would charge these exorbitant rents for very dilapidated housing. And so Black people, so it's like it's a Black tax and a poor tax. You had to simply pay more to live in horrible conditions. And so interestingly, one of the cases that's discussed is Lorraine Hansberry's father. So Lorraine Hansberry is very important. Anyway, let me not go into this whole thing. But anyway, there's an early Supreme Court case that people think challenged restrictive covenants, but it actually didn't, because they didn't say that restrictive covenants were unconstitutional. What they said was that those who had implemented the restrictive covenant hadn't kind of involved everybody in the process, and therefore they hadn't done their due diligence in affirming the restrictive covenant, and that was what was unconstitutional. And so there's a way in which, you know, even the sort of the victories through the courts they're, as Matthew mentioned earlier, they're reversible. Reversibility is a sort of an ongoing story when it comes to any issues of civil rights, that they're not durable, right? And so I think that's important to note.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Sorry, Matthew.
No, I was going to say, I would add too that you can maneuver around them as well. So even now, the first house that I bought, I've sent my application in via the internet. All of my other friends who were buying houses did it in person at the time. All African-American, the friends that I'm referring to in this instance. And when I got my application back, two things happened. Number one, when I got to the back, the agent checked off Caucasian/white in the demographic box. So I found out I was white. And then I also had an interest rate that was less than half of the interest rate that all of my other Black friends who had applied for loans in person, when the people had actually seen them. And so while on paper, this may be illegal now, the practice of it still continues, and it has an effect. And when I asked the young man who processed my application, I said, can you tell me why you checked Caucasian here? And of course, he started with all of I'm not racist and all that stuff. And I said, brother, I didn't say you were racist, even though the act was racist, but I didn't say you were racist. I just really want to know why you checked that box off. And he said, well, I looked at your zip code, I looked at your earnings, and I looked at your credit score, right? And of course, Black people don't live in quote unquote nice neighborhoods. Black people don't make good money, and Black people, especially Black men, quote unquote, don't have good credit. And so he just made, and this is the last one. And he said, and you sound white. Right. So there's ways around all of this, even now, that affect our earning potential and our ability to build transgenerational wealth.
Andy, can I cut in with a question?
Please do.
It's from Jake, and maybe to Matthew and Charisse. Does the racist ideology blended into the 1950s US impact massively upon North and South communities that were obsessed with the American dream and commercialism that was evident at the time? So I guess the question is, was racist ideology blended in with the idea of the American dream at the time?
I'll defer to Charisse just now, because I just finished going off on a tangent.
Well, the American dream is constitutively white. Like, let's be clear. It is theoretically, it's a liberal one that, anybody with, luck and pluck and gumption can succeed. But I think that the whole sort of constitution of what the dream actually is a white and a capitalist one. But that being said, I think that both not only racist ideology, but racism as a material and structural practice is embedded in the American dream for in ways that Dr. Whitaker just mentioned, insofar as if it is that buying a home is foundational to the American dream, and you cannot buy a home, or the cost is too great to purchase a home, then you are just foreclosed from that reality, right? If upward mobility is constitutive of the American dream, and you are not upwardly mobile, or it is extremely difficult to pursue that upward mobility, then the American dream doesn't apply to you. Now, I want to guard against this caste argument. I'm writing something about this now. It's not caste, right? It's not a caste system, but the racism makes it incredibly difficult and incredibly costly and incredibly burdensome to pursue the contents of the American dream. And I think that that's what makes it racialist and racist.
Yeah. And all of this was by design. And if one would do a statistical analysis of how many people have made the American dream, right? And let's just say home ownership is the foundation of that. There's a gross imbalance in inequity in those numbers. So the American dream is defined by the acquisition of property and wealth, if you factor in the population and our demographics, has not worked out for the majority of Americans. And it was never intended to be. So our founders were land-owning white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men. And even among the white population now, a great many of them are not Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So when you start with that design, when you start and create policies and practices to ensure that those folks will be overrepresented among those ranks, 400 years later, there's all sorts of ways that you can maintain that outside of the legal system.
And in this photograph here is just a small element of that, isn't it? Just a small element of what you can, the bigger.
Yeah. Oh, and you're right. And by the way, if this family of this young Black girl would have been bold enough to actually move into the neighborhood, if they could pull it off, they probably would have been visited within days and offered somewhere between 18 to 30% above market value for their home, because they wouldn't be happy there. If that didn't work, generally their homes were spray painted with racial epitaphs on them. If that didn't work, cross burnings, banks not lending them money, the entire community would band together to keep these folks out of the neighborhood. So it goes beyond just this sign and the realtors and the banks.
Thank you, Dr. Whitaker. Can we move on to our next slide? That'd be great. And hopefully one closer to home, I believe, Arizona.
Yeah, I'm just going to be brief. This is just my own pet peeve. My first book is The History of the Civil Rights Movement in Phoenix. Many people don't look at Black struggle for freedom, civil rights, Black activism, and think of the American West. Black Lives Matters, two of the leaders of Black Lives Matters in America emerged from Arizona, particularly Opal Tometi, at least at that particular time. Brown versus Board of Education, one of the primary cases that informed that decision in 1954 was a 1953 case in Phoenix, where Phoenix desegregated its schools almost a year before Brown. That was a footnote in the national case, but few people understand that. So the movement happened everywhere. And when I travel the globe to speak, and in fact, in other areas of the United States, I generally hear from folks, wow, number one, I didn't know there were Black people in Arizona. We just thought they were cowboys and John Wayne, and you guys are punching doggies and chasing Gila monsters or whatever that you do in the West. Or I tend to think just of the Latinx population and the Native American population. And of course, many folks, the stereotype is that all of those folks are living on reservations, when in fact, a great majority of the indigenous populations are urban, quote unquote, urban Indians. So I just throw this out there to let folks know that there were Black folks here. There was a movement here. And that movement had a great effect on the national movement. One of the first sit-ins in the United States happened in Phoenix in 1945. It was led by a 16-year-old woman by the name of Opal Ellis, who is in, oh, I can show you, but she's in this picture in the back all the way. She's not in the front. And the final thing that I want to indicate is you never know in doing history. One of the fun aspects of history is I was giving a talk in Arizona once, and the lady on the left side of the picture with a white top standing next to the man with the last sign in the back. She was much older at the time, but she came to one of my talks. I used this picture and identified herself in this picture.
Wow.
And it was just an emotional moment. And she thanked me for writing down the history, because she said at the time, we didn't even know if we would win, let alone show up in a book sometime. So
Matthew, I've got to ask, has she seen that photo before?
She had not seen that photo before.
Oh, wow.
In fact, when I was doing my research, there was no repository in the state of civil rights photos or of African-American history. I created one. It's called the Matthew Whitaker Collection, and it's the first one. Most of the photos I got were in basements in churches, people's homes, lots of cobwebs and free dinners that caused me to gain quite a bit of weight. But yeah, they were nowhere easily accessible.
Is that the right arrow I've put on there, Matthew, by the way?
Yeah, you got it.
Oh, you got it.
You guys are great at this, by the way. Yeah. Yep. And keep in mind, this was during the summer of I believe this was 62. This is the summer of 1962. And if you know anything about Arizona, you know that it was probably over 110 out there during this protest. And it was so hot. And so they protested in waves. So they would have people come and take their place, and those folks would go bathe, rest, eat, and they would come back at another time. So they literally had a chart of when they were supposed to show up to protest so they wouldn't burn out. And they did that from 1957 to 1964.
That's astonishing. Absolutely astonishing. Look, Matthew, Charisse, if you're there, I just wanted to say on behalf of the TMI History Icons, a huge thank you from the team, and I'm sure on behalf of those who have listened today. We have one more image. Not forgetting, yes, Miss Jackson.
Yes, this is Joan Trumpauer Mulholland. She was one of the white, what we would call allies now, during the Freedom Summer in the South, who went down with hundreds of other young white people to join with Black folks and struggle. And I put this picture up now because there's been lots of conversation about allies, accomplices, advocates, however you want to name it. And one of the things that I do, because I actually do a training on white allyship, doing one in a couple of weeks. And one of the first things that I tell folks, ask them is, number one, do you have the heart of an ally, and what does an ally look like? And so for many people of African descent, an ally looks like this woman here, because she left the Midwest. She went to Duke University, a very elite university in the South, got involved in the civil rights movement, withdrew from Duke, registered in a historically Black college, protested in the movement, was beaten and assaulted and sent to the worst prison in Louisiana, where this mugshot was taken, in solidarity. And so when we talk about allyship, historically, these folks can tell you a lot. They were willing to sacrifice, number one, that's safety, finances, popularity. If Facebook were around back then, she probably would have lost a lot of friends. And when she was finished, she went back with school. She went back, learned a little bit more, got a master's degree, and then dedicated the rest of her life to aiding folks. So it wasn't a moment, it was a movement for her. And she put some skin in the game, meaning her own life and her own funds. And so for many people who ask me, what does it take to be a good ally, if you want to use that term, I point to somebody like her.
Thank you for your choice. That's great. Charisse, are you there? Is there anything you'd like?
I am here.
Anything you'd like to add to Matthew's choice of or finish today regarding the images as a whole that we've looked at and the history behind?
For the previous image, what I was thinking about is, so back to my Du Bois obsession. So Shirley Graham Du Bois during World War II actually was stationed at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and there was a violent issue of a sort of a court martial issue on the base as a result of an altercation between Black and white soldiers. That was also a galvanizing moment. So Shirley Graham Du Bois was a field secretary for the NAACP, and so that particular incident also was a sort of a moment of organization and sort of racial consciousness in Arizona. So just to say, don't sleep on Arizona. It's important. It's hot, and there's not a huge Black population, but there's some really important things happen there. Not least because of the military base. There's at least two. There's Davis Monthan and the Fort Huachuca, but also Raytheon, and so there's a lot of stuff around militarism. There's a lot of transient population. So there's it's a fecund place for activism. Beyond just sort of with the Black populations. And then in terms of this picture, the other thing the person I always think of as, well, there's two people that I think of as white comrades. One is, of course, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who was a very close comrade to Claudia Jones and, she's somebody else that you all could look into, but also Jane Fonda. And Jane Fonda is still writing. What's the way Joy Beckhart, she dragged her recently on The View around this issue of rioting and looting and violence or whatever, and whether or not how Black people should be protesting. And Jane Fonda was like, well, it's up to them. You can't really tell Black people how they should be protesting. And so these are all good models. And so, a lot of white folks will ask Black people, what can we do? Well, instead of asking us, you have a lot of models for that work. My personal favorite is John Brown, of course, but there's a lot of models for that work. So.
Charrise, Matthew, thank you ever so much. We really appreciate your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you for the first time and to learn so much about the civil rights movement through 10 of your well-chosen sources. So thank you so much. As I said, on behalf of TMI History Icons, we really appreciate everything you've done this evening. Tom, would you like to add anything more?
Just to say it was absolutely fantastic. I think anybody in this webinar will have got so much value out of that. I certainly did. I was absolutely enthralled from start to finish. Obviously, we know that you guys have just literally given up your time to do this for history teachers in the UK. It's absolutely amazing that you've done that. And the quality of what you've shared is going to be massively impactful. You can see in the comments from people how impactful that's going to be. There will be another History Behind in about 3 weeks' time. Yes, I don't know if I've got a date. I was trying to find a date a minute ago, couldn't find it, but there is one. Do you know the date, Andy, of the next one?
No, we will put it on our Twitter feed after the quiz tonight.
We will. And thanks ever so much. Charisse, thanks so much. And by the way, 15 degrees is hot for us. we head to the beach.
Oh my! Is that what you're talking about, or centigrade or whatever? That can't be Fahrenheit.
My ginger eye doesn't help. I'll tell you. It doesn't take much for me to turn like a tomato. I'll tell you. Anyway. Anyway,
that's all right. When you visit again, I know where to take you, where you can get some shade and some sun. You'll be all right.
Guys, keep in touch, and we'll be tweeting. So cheers.
Thank you so much.
The recording's available as well. So if you want to look at this, we're going to publish the recording for every single person who signed up. I think 350 signed up. So the recording will go for free to everybody who signed up. And in addition to that, also it'll go on YouTube as well. I think Scott's is our tech god, and he's basically going to chop it up and put bits of it on YouTube, or maybe the whole thing. I might actually put it on, just the whole thing. So thanks again from me.
Dutch Squid.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you later, Charisse. Bye.